Hello, and welcome to the podcast's Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. And for those of you who love our Bible and Beyond podcasts, would you please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page? Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to join at any level just right for you. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
I am so happy to welcome back to the Bible and Beyond podcast our friend and scholar, Dr. Samuel Zinner. His brand new translation and commentary on one of the important Nag Hammadi books caught my attention because he thinks it can help us sort out the ancient relationship between Jews and Christians and Gnostics. We've had so many questions about that. I thought this would be a great time to ask Dr. Zinner. So let me share with you just a little of his academic work. He's a scholar of modern and ancient languages, literature, and history, and has been published internationally in a variety of languages by Oxford University Press, de Gruyter, and others. He's contributed to articles. He has contributed articles to Religions Journal and served as peer review referee for several academic journals. He's currently an editor for the forthcoming Origins and Applications of Language and Number, with contributions from several eminent scholars. And he presents at conferences such as the Bible and the Qur'an, Comparative Studies, at the Shahid Beshita University in Tehran. I'm really glad to welcome you, Samuel. Welcome back.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Shirley. Good to be here.
I'm quite delighted to have you back with us because of this big question that I hear so often in both the public square and even among scholars. How do you know if some ancient text is Gnostic? So your new book just seems to flow back and forth between Jewish, Christian, and Gnostic ideas. It's a translation and commentary on the secret book of James. And I should mention that scholars tend to refer to this text as the Apocryphon of James. And your book is definitely in the scholarly category. The title is The Apocryphon of James, NHC 1-2. NHC stands for Nag Hammadi Codices. Anyway, so from this book, I think you're going to be a great help with this question that so many of us want to ask. What makes something Gnostic, and how does it relate in the Jewish and Christian world? So, since the secret book of James is clearly one of those books among the collection found at Nag Hammadi, people often just assume that it must be Gnostic. So before we get into our specific question, maybe you should give us a brief overview of this book so we know what it's about. Can we start there?
Sure. The Apocryphon of James, the word Apocryphon is basically the contrast or the opposite to Apocalypse, which is an unveiling. So an Apocryphon is making something secret or something that is secret. Right. But anyway, this is presenting or portraying the teachings of Jesus, mainly to James and Peter, right, over an 18-day period that culminates with his final ascent. Because it's a pretty elaborate, I think, narrative frame. That is, there's a death of Jesus, followed by a resurrection, which is simultaneously an ascent to heaven, where he stays for, I think it's 550 days, and then comes back to earth, teaches for 18 days to James and Peter, as I said, and then goes back to heaven, right, on a permanent basis, right? And so he's teaching about the kingdom and other themes that we'll talk about later, and then ascends at the end.
Okay.
For part of the ascent, James and Peter accompany him. So it's interesting. But that's how it wraps up, with an ascent. Jesus' successful ascent, James and Peter not so successful.
Okay. Well, that's quite a story. So James and Peter get to partially ascend, and that's basically the story.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, well then to get at our basic question, how do we know if this text is Gnostic or not? Maybe you could tell us, say, 2 or 3 key identifiers that would tell us if something is Gnostic or not. Can we go there?
Well, scholars like to, these days, differentiate, right, between different groups of Gnostics, right? And so because they've complained, I think justifiably so, that Gnostic is just too general a term. So what does it mean?
Yeah.
Right. So, but on the other hand, right, the idea that a multiplication of labels, inventing more labels, it might be helpful, right? But it can also just make things more complex as well. So I think, yeah, we need both. We should maintain the general term Gnostic or Gnosticism. And this is, so scholars want to jettison it, but I don't think that's wise. I think we need the general term Gnostic, and then, sure, we have all the other terms like the Sethian Gnosticism, Valentinian Gnosticism, etc., etc. And so scholars like to make a differentiation between the different groups of Gnostics, right? Because we can't generalize. Some of them had different emphases than others. But of course, right, they all seem to share an interest in gnosis, right, or knowledge, the importance of knowledge and understanding. Mm-hmm. A lot of, not all of them, but a lot of them have an emphasis on, we would say asceticism, but I'll be more blunt, just say celibacy, right? So many of these texts in the Nag Hammadi library and elsewhere that are called Gnostic often have these polemics against like getting married or having sex and having children, because this is perpetuating the evil physical universe, right? Which was, according to the Gnostics, created by the evil demiurge, right? And now that's the one element that if you find it in a text, you probably can be sure it's Gnostic. And that is the idea that the creator of the world, in the sense of the universe, was a demiurge, but that this demiurge was evil or unjust, right? So that's
Can I stop you for just a second and ask you to describe a demiurge just a little more? Like, that's an unusual word sometimes. So what is a demiurge?
Yeah, the demiurgos, this is a figure that's in between, let's say, the creation, and it's the creator. So the demiurge is the creator, but above the demiurge is what many of the Gnostics would call the God above God, the transcendent God, right? You have parallels to that in the history of religions, right? Meister Eckhart in Christian mysticism would talk about the God above God, right? And then the God we can understand, the God above God, is totally beyond our comprehension. Really not much to say about it. But the God who creates the universe is a God that can participate in eternity and act in history and influence events, right? And the God you can pray to. But anyway, the biblical God, according to the Gnostics, was not a good God that created a good universe. It was an evil God who created a really rotten universe, right? And so it's this evil demiurge or evil creator.
Okay.
Right? If you find that in the text, you can know it's Gnostic.
Okay.
Right? We don't find that in the Apocryphon of James, by the way.
That's what I was going to ask you next. And then obviously I was going to say, well, then do you find these things in the secret book of James or the Apocryphon of James?
No, you don't find an evil demiurge, right? But to be fair, of course, or to be accurate, not every Gnostic text needs to mention the evil demiurge. So there can be Gnostic texts, right, that don't mention the demiurge.
Okay.
Right? So the demiurge's presence is not obligatory. Right? Okay. So that's why there's a difference of opinion among scholars, right, whether or not the Apocryphon of James is quote unquote Gnostic.
Yeah.
Right. So and also doesn't also another indicator of Gnostic text often will be an elaborate system of divine emanations called the eons, right? similar to what are called the Sephirot in Jewish Kabbalah. But anyway, that's much later. But so this elaborate system of the emanations, these powers that come from God, this is from the good God, is not present in the Apocryphon of James. There's no evil demiurge in there either, but there is an emphasis on knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? But the problem with that is, well, sure, you also find an emphasis on knowledge in the Bible, right? Like the book of Psalms, right? Which where we get this phrase, the light of knowledge, right? And the book of Proverbs, right, has a heavy emphasis on chokhmah or wisdom, right? So, and then also in the Torah, also like in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a heavy emphasis portraying the nation of Israel as a people whose wisdom and understanding, right, transcends that of the other nations. Right? And so there's a traditional emphasis on we call it the virtue of knowledge,
Right.
wisdom, understanding, education in Judaism, right? It's rooted in the Hebrew Bible. Right? So you find it later in Jewish tradition as well, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah. All right. So, if we're talking about maybe gnosis, as I can see how that would be connected to Gnosticism. So there's a passage in the secret book of James where Jesus is teaching his disciples that they need to understand the great light and they need to listen to the message and understand knowledge. Would you say that is evidence of Gnostic teaching?
Well, it's congruent with Gnostic teaching, but it's not. It can't be used diagnostically, put it that way, because so much of non-Gnostic Jewish and Christian texts, right, have these same emphases, right? And you find a heavy dose of that in like Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish theologian philosopher, right, who was a contemporary of Jesus.
Yeah.
Right. And the great light, well, the light of knowledge, as I said, this is a biblical term. So light being a metaphor, right? And the phrase, the great light, where does it come from? Oh, chapter 1 of the book of Genesis,
Okay.
right? It's the sun, and the moon is the lesser light. And so the sun is the greater light. And this is a metaphor for, right, greater knowledge, right? So even the terminology is derived from the Bible, right? But it becomes a metaphor for knowledge. Right?
All right. So now I think you're leading us to a really important point here that you're finding, especially in your book here. I was going back and forth as I was reading it between the Jewish and the Christian and maybe Gnostic kinds of ideas in a real kind of a blending of all of them. So earlier you were saying that there's all these different kinds of categories of Gnostics and so forth. Are you giving us the idea that this blending is real, or is it am I imagining things?
Well, we could think of a blending, but I think that the situation here is a little more subtle or complex, and that is, it is significant that we find this text, the secret book of James, in a collection of Gnostic writings. Right? We can't ignore that. However, not everything in these codices has to be therefore Gnostic. Right? For instance, there's a fragment or a passage from Plato. Right? Certainly not Gnostic, but
Right.
Plato is important for Gnosticism. Of course, many of the Gnostic tropes and ways of thinking, like paradigms, are derived ultimately from Plato, right? Through the later Middle Platonic trajectory, and depending on which text we're talking about, the later texts in the Nag Hammadi corpus, also through the much later Neo-Platonic trajectory, right? So, if a text in the Nag Hammadi library is not Gnostic, it still is significant that it appealed to Gnostics, right? So we can see that certain types of literature with certain types of emphases would appeal to the Gnostics, even if it didn't originate from their own groups, right? And so this is what I think is the case. I don't see anything explicitly Gnostic in the secret book of James, but the emphases in it, right, on self-knowledge, for instance, and salvation through knowledge, right? This would appeal to them. And from the very beginning, when the Gnostic groups formed, which is probably sometime in the 2nd century of the Common Era, right? The attraction to these types of ideas were there from the very beginning, I think, in most of these groups, right? And yes, knowledge leading to life and salvation, and many of them also have this heavy interest in ritual ascent, cultivating ascent, visionary ascents to heaven, which we can talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, I'm going to.
So it's not Gnostic. I don't think it's originating from a Gnostic group, but it appealed to Gnostics the way Plato did.
I want to get into the whole question about ascending in a little bit, but you're raising another new idea here that I think is interesting. That you're talking about ideas that appeal to this group, as opposed to, I think, the way we've sort of been taught for so long that Gnostics were just anti or against or fighting or opposing, real Christianity or real Judaism or something. But I think you're painting it in a very new kind of light here by saying these were people who are probably coming from these traditions, but finding other new ideas that are appealing to them. And that appeal may be shifting or changing their views of things. Is that fair to say that?
Yes, but it doesn't get you the whole way, because there certainly are aspects of some of the Gnostic groups, especially what's called the Sethian Gnostic groups, of course, where you have this, again, the biblical God becomes the evil demiurge. This is definitely a rejection, right, and a turning upside down, and a sign of opposition, right, to put it in everyday language, like most of the churches, right, that represent historical Christianity, right, or right the historical synagogues, right. So yes, that's right. It depends on the group. The Sethians, I think, they were real opponents, right? Okay. Even though they incorporated a lot of ideas and traditions, more or less unchanged, right, from Jewish and Christian sources, right? But then, again, you can't generalize. Let's say, like even you have to make a distinction between the historical Valentinus, right, and the movement that came to be named after him, Valentinian Gnosticism, or the Valentinian Church, whatever you want to call it. Even the Valentinian system, right, which comes after the historical Valentinus, it's quite different from Sethian Gnosticism.
All right. I want to just stop you for a second here, because you're using words that people may not know. You're using Sethian and Valentinian. And I think we probably ought to distinguish that just a little bit. They may not. Yeah,
the Sethian Gnosticism is the type, the brand that you see in like the Apocryphon of John, right? The secret book of John, where it's a heavy emphasis on God is evil, right? And Adam and Eve, the devil figure in the story about the Garden of Eden was actually the positive figure, and God actually was sort of jealous and didn't want Adam and Eve to be enlightened because he felt threatened. This type of really, really radical, contradiction to the Hebrew Bible. This is what we see in a lot of what scholars have called Sethian Gnostic texts. Okay. Valentinus was an early Christian teacher. We're not sure of his dates. We're not sure much about his life, other than that he probably lived to about 150 or so, the Common Era. Almost became like a bishop in Rome, probably. But he was never excommunicated, but later, starting with maybe Irenaeus, an early church father who wrote this compendium against the heresies, turned him into a heretic, basically. But if you look at what Valentinus actually taught, the historical Valentinus, he was very close to Philo of Alexandria. So, but we cannot really find, in the fragments of Valentinus, we can't really find him teaching almost anything that we find among the later students of Valentinus, right? So it's like they went their own way, and people have attributed their teachings to the historical Valentinus. And it doesn't appear to be the case. But anyway, Valentinus doesn't seem to have had this negative animus against the biblical God, right, that a lot of Gnostics had. So different groups have these different valences, right, and different emphases when it comes to talking about the nature of creation, the nature of God. And then I don't want to go on too much longer, but even in Valentinianism, right, scholars make a distinction between Eastern and Western Valentinianism. Right. And they have their differences. Some of them are stark, right? So,
right. So why don't we go on to then this idea of ascending, because that's that you caught our attention on that when you said that James and Peter were partly ascending and then didn't make it, and then Jesus goes on. Okay, tell us about ascending in the secret book of James.
Yeah, well, this is a ritual practice, not only in ancient Judaism, right, but in religions in general. Often will tend to have this visionary experiences. But in Judaism, it took the form of the repetition of prayers, which facilitated one's visionary ascent to see what's called the Merkavah, or the throne, the chariot, which has the throne of God on it, the divine chariot, right? As described in Ezekiel chapter 1, with the mind-bending, many-faced heavenly creatures and cherubim and all of this, just really mind-blowing vision that he had.
Yeah.
And so we find different narrative descriptions of these types of events. Like, for instance, at the end of the first book of Enoch, the Ethiopic book of Enoch, at the end of the parables of Enoch, there's a portrayal of Enoch who ascends to God, and he is transformed, right? And then this is carried forward in the second book of Enoch, where Enoch ascends and is transfigured into a fiery entity known as Metatron. I won't develop that, but anyway, also the Apocryphon of James, the secret book of James, in my opinion, is being influenced in its ascent narrative by, it's echoing Enoch's ascent in the first book of Enoch, and Isaiah's ascent in the Ascension of Isaiah, which itself is based on the second book of Enoch, right? So there's a heavy Enochic component here, right? And so Jesus is ascending after teaching for 18 days, and Peter and James are following him. But then before they can have a vision of this throne, the glorious God on his throne, the other disciples speak up, right? And sort of like break their concentration, their visionary concentration. And so, right, they're back on earth, right? So it's obviously an ascent that's taking place, not in the physical body, not with the physical body, but right in the mind or the spirit, which sort of implies that was according to this book, the modality of Jesus' own ascent.
Oh, okay.
Right, so it wasn't necessarily physical, just like James and Peter wasn't physically ascending. It was a visionary ascent, Right? So that this opens up a whole can of worms that we don't want to go into in a short podcast like this. But so the ascent, the final ascent of Jesus to heaven, according to this text, was, I think, more or less portrayed as a visionary ascent. This didn't necessarily involve his physical body. So that raises the question of, well, all this teaching that Jesus gives for 18 days, was this the teaching from a physical body, or this was being experienced in the spirit? Who knows?
Right.
But, it's
So,
intriguing.
are you making a connection then between learning or gnosis or understanding and ascend? I mean,
That's right. Yeah, you're not going to ascend if you haven't mastered gnosis. And according to Jesus in this text, the main form of gnosis you need to know are two things, and they're interrelated, actually. That is the word, which, right, already in Deuteronomy 30, the word is a title for the Torah, right? And self-knowledge. So you got to know yourself. So the link between the two is that, well, what the Torah is teaching, the knowledge that you must know, the knowledge of Torah is self-knowledge, right? To know Torah is to know yourself. To know yourself is to know the law, the Torah of Moses, right? And so, yeah, you have to know yourself. You have to have self-knowledge, knowledge of the Torah, to be a mature spiritual person. And only mature spiritual people, right, are going to ascend and have these heavenly visions. Right?
This seems, I may be not hearing you correctly, but it sounds like you're putting this in the position that's sort of between the Jewish understanding of ascending and then Jesus being an example of this kind of thing that's explained through this kind of a text. Am I hearing that right, or am I just imagining?
It is explained through what? I didn't hear that.
I'm just trying. It just sounds like we're finding that this Gnostic idea of gnosis, anyway, is kind of a bridge between the Jewish understanding of ascending and then Jesus being the example of it.
Yeah, well, as I said, many traditions were practicing this. You can look elsewhere in the Nag Hammadi library, for instance, in the Revelation of Peter, or Apocalypse of Peter. And Jesus tells Peter, put your cloak over your eyes and tell me what you see. And he says, I don't see anything. All right. I mean, if you cover your eyes with your cloak, you're not going to see anything. So Jesus says, okay, do it again and tell me what you see. And so after he does it the second time, then Peter starts relating a vision he's having. So this is, view it as well, we can decode it this way. This is telling us actually one of the techniques that were likely used by people to facilitate, we could say induce, but to facilitate these visionary experiences, right? Different traditions do different things. Some of them, you pray certain ways that restricts your breathing, and so that cuts off circulation to your brain, and so you start, to go to altered states of consciousness.
Wow.
Right? There's all sorts of some you put your head down between your two knees, right? And so that's cutting off the circulation. Again, it's a facilitating an altered state of consciousness, which helps people to, induce these visionary states. And so that's what it looks like is happening. Well, that's what's happening in like the Apocalypse of Peter, which is definitely a Gnostic text. And in some of the other Nag Hammadi texts, we seem to have the same thing going on. Different types of techniques are being used to have visionary experiences. So this was important among the Gnostics to have these visionary experiences. We know that it was important among Hermetic groups of the time. And in fact, there are Hermetic writings in the Nag Hammadi library. Again, you see that type of literature appealed to them, right? And it was also important in Judaism. And so this in the Apocryphon of James, the language that is used for the ascent seems to be very Enochic, and so it's echoing the Jewish books of Enoch, but it also has a little bit of Hermetic terminology, right? thrown in there. So you see that there was no contradiction between the two, right? And a lot of Jewish and so-called Jewish Christian sources, like obviously, are using Hermetic language, Hermetic terms, right? Hermetic ideas, right? And so again, they were not seeing these things as contradictory.
Yeah.
They were able to integrate them.
All right. So now you brought up another term, Hermetic. You probably should explain a little bit about what that means.
The main body of Hermetic text is in English, known by the Latin title Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermetic treatises. And these are wisdom discourses and ascent discourses put into the mouth of Egyptian mythological figures, right, to students of learning. And some of the maxims and aphorisms that we find in there are very similar. Sometimes scholars even think that they're like quoted, quote unquote, cited, like echoed in texts like the Gospel of Thomas, right? These very short paradoxical sayings that to some people like Zen, koans, like short paradoxical sayings, because the idea was there's certain truths that cannot be taught directly. You have to teach them indirectly through paradoxical statements and parables, right, and enigmas, right, and so that type of thinking that there is a necessity for enigma and paradox. This is any religion that has a mystical body of teachings is going to use that type of thinking. You don't have to borrow it elsewhere, but it's just it's a very common insight that goes across the board, across religions, that there are certain truths or realities that cannot be discussed or described directly. You have to do it indirectly. The analogy I like to use very quickly is, if you know this, the structure of the human eye, right? If you're looking up in the night sky at a particularly low magnitude, a dim star, if you look at it directly, it fades from your vision. But if you look at it to the side, you see it.
Yeah.
Right? So you can't look at it directly. You got to look at it to the side. So certain ideas are that way. We can't grasp them directly, only indirectly through paradoxes, parables, stories, things like this.
Wow, what a fascinating way to sort of end this conversation with the secret book of James, which seems like it's a secret for us. But, I really appreciate the way you have such a knowledge of the Jewish and Christian and Hermetic and other communities going on at the same time that these books are being talked about and even being produced. Am I hearing you right by thinking that you're envisioning the secret book of James as sort of maybe a comfortable mix with Jewish and Christian and Gnostic ideas? Or how do you see them?
Yeah, what I would say is that this is, there's a comfortable mix between Jewish and Christian ideas, definitely. Because what we have in there, I think, is a writing that's coming from a group of Jesus followers who, I believe, who descended in some way, who had inherited the teachings and ideas of the historical James, the brother of Jesus. Mm. All right. Of course, things have been changed and developed, but I think ultimately that was where the roots were, and that's why it's attributed to James. And I think it's the brother of Jesus that they intend to portray. And so James was very dedicated to Judaism and to Torah, right? And famously in the New Testament, like the epistle or the letter of Paul to the Galatians, we know that there was great enmity between Paul and James. Mm-hmm. And in fact, James and his group, right, basically for the entirety of Paul's career, right, Paul was on the others, there was a lot of enmity between them. Let's put it that way, which put Paul in a very odd position, since James was the brother of Jesus. So there's the Jewish and the Christian elements, right, in the Apocryphon of James, and many of the emphases in there, which we also find in pre-Christian Judaism, like Philo of Alexandria, as I mentioned. Those types of ideas with the emphasis on knowledge and self-knowledge were something that appealed to the Gnostics. So even though I don't see a direct Gnostic component in the Apocryphon of James, certainly there were the ideas that appealed to the Gnostics, which is why it ended up in the Nag Hammadi codices, which probably for the most part, they are Gnostic books, right? From very different Gnostics, like Sephia and Valentinian and others besides.
Well, this is very interesting for you to use this book to show us the complexity and the interesting connections that look like they can go down lots of different rabbit holes, but lots of ways of understanding what's appealing to this particular group of people. Fascinating way to talk about that. So in case anybody didn't get the idea yet, this is the book. It's the Apocryphon of James. That it's a rather scholarly book, but it's also a fascinating book, I think, in the way you put together a translation right next to the Coptic, so you can read it in Coptic and in English. And then you have a wonderful commentary explaining kind of verse by verse when you get stuck. Wonderful ideas. Thank you so much for coming to share that with us. I really, really do appreciate this, Samuel.
You're welcome. So always a pleasure, Shirley.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode from the show notes on the website, earlychristiantexts.com. Or just come browse around on the website to find all the other resources provided for you there. Also, we ask for your support to keep producing these podcast interviews. Please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page at patreon.com/Bible and Beyond. And we love hearing from you on the Facebook page at Early Christian Texts or Twitter at EarlyXIAN Texts. Be sure to come back next month for our next episode on Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond.